From the Forbidden Case Files of Old New England, The Shadow Farm. Chapter 5. Lance felt an inexplicable pull toward the barn, a compulsion that both repelled and fascinated him. He reached for his revolver, seeking the cold comfort of the weapon's steel, only to be reminded with a jolt that he had pawned it back in Arkham. A bitter curse escaped his lips as he steeled himself, clenching his fists and pressing on toward the barn. The path was uneven, the ground soft and treacherous, but Lance's focus was unyielding. Lance noticed tire tracks had cut deep ruts into the pathway to the barn, appearing like open wounds on the flesh of the farm, and they appeared recent. He could discern no tracks leading back. Whatever automobile had come this way had made a one-way trip. As he reached the barn, he paused for a moment at the threshold, peering into the gloom within. The faint light of the moon barely penetrated the darkness, casting long shadows across the dirt floor. Taking a deep breath, Lance slipped through the ajar door, the creaking of the hinge sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. Inside, the barn smelled of dust, mold, and something far less identifiable, something that reeked of decay. Lance's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he saw a large object shrouded under a heavy tarp in the center of the barn. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to flee. But his curiosity and his determination to find out what had happened to Frank drove him forward. With a trembling hand, Lance grasped the edge of the tarp and pulled it back. What lay beneath caused him to gasp in terror. The tarp had been covering a 1928 Ford Model A, its once sleek body now caked in dust and grime. Lance recognized the car instantly. Frank had sent him a newspaper clipping advertising the model when he'd purchased it. Lance had been envious, unable to afford the $500 price tag himself. But now, all thoughts of envy were driven from his mind as he saw what was sitting in the driver's seat. It was Frank, or what was left of him. The corpse was horrifyingly mummified, the skin shriveled and leathery, clinging to the bones like a grotesque mask. Frank's once dark hair was now streaked with white, and his eyes were gone, leaving only dark, empty sockets that stared out in a silent scream. The mouth hung open, the jaw unhinged, as if the dead man had been in the midst of a final, desperate plea for help. Lance stumbled back, his mind reeling, a wave of nausea threatening to overtake him. He had seen death before, but nothing like this, nothing so unnatural, so wrong. Fighting to regain his composure, Lance forced himself to step closer, to examine the body with the detached eye of an investigator. The head was tilted back, and the cause of death was apparent. A gunshot wound to the temple. The revolver was still clenched in the brittle, emaciated hand, the metal dull and corroded with age. Suicide, it seemed. But something was off. The body looked as though it had been dead for years, not days or weeks. What could have caused Frank's body to desiccate so rapidly, leaving him looking more like a dried-out mummy than a man? Lance swallowed hard and removed the revolver from Frank's hand, feeling a strange sense of both relief and sorrow. As he rifled through Frank's pockets, he found only some loose change and dry-cleaning tickets, nothing that would explain what had happened. On the seat beside Frank, partially obscured by dried blood spray, was a folder. Lance picked it up, the paper crinkling and flaking with age, and turned on the car's headlights, kneeling in front of them to read the contents. The folder contained mostly handwritten notes in Frank's familiar scrawl, his personal shorthand, barely legible to anyone but Lance. He scanned the pages, piecing together the details of Frank's investigation. Frank had been meeting with the auctioneer to try to delay the sale of the Hendrickson farm until any heirs could be found. The auctioneer worked for a shady real estate brokerage, the Traskin Group, with ties to several European crime families, and surprisingly enough, or not Lance thought, powerful spiritualist groups. They had threatened Frank several times, demanding that he drop the case and let them sell the farm. Frank had not been able to find a direct descendant to Jacob Hendrickson, but did find the equivalency of a third cousin once removed, which would satisfy the legal requirements to inherit the farm. This did not sit well with the Traskin Group. Frank had persisted in finding the heir, and with knowledge of a distant relative, it was just a matter of contacting them. Despite the threats, Frank had persisted and noted that he might have found a distant heir. The proof, however, was in his office, no doubt the reason it had been ransacked. Lance's mind raced. Perhaps Frank had been kidnapped and driven back out here to the farm. Maybe the real estate thugs had tried to scare him into dropping the case or to silence him permanently. But why would Frank have shot himself? And why did his body look as it did? As if the very life had been drained from him. But why? Why any of this? This farm was not that large, and Lance could not see anything about it being worth the trouble the Traskin group had been putting itself through. It surely had not been worth Frank's life. Determined to find more answers, Lance decided to check the trunk of the car. The thought of finding anything else horrific made his skin crawl, but he had to know. The trunk latch popped open with a metallic ring, and Lance had to stifle a yelp as another mummified corpse rolled out of the trunk. Aside from the corpse, the trunk only contained 3 large canisters of petrol, the sharp, acrid smell of the fuel mixing cloyingly with the smell of decay that permeated the barn. Maybe the kidnapper had planned on burning Frank's body and other evidence. Then he turned his attention back to the corpse staring up at him from the barn floorboards. This body had been a large man in life, but now his clothes hung loosely on his desiccated frame. Like Frank, this man's skin was leathery, his hair sparse and white, and his eye sockets were empty, black pits. The stench of death, long past its prime, filled the air as Lance prodded the man's coat open with a pencil, covering his mouth with his hand as larval flies began crawling from between the corpse's lips. Inside the coat was a shoulder holster, holding a 1911 automatic with 2 clips, and in an inside pocket was a wallet. Lance gingerly fished the wallet out, returning to the front of the car where the light was better. The ID inside identified the man as Cesaro Patelli, an employee of Traskin Auction House and Real Estate Holdings, the very auctioneer Frank had mentioned. The wallet also contained nearly $40, which Lance pocketed, deciding the deceased no longer had any need for it. As Lance turned back to retrieve the pistol, a sudden blinding pain exploded across the back of his skull. He stumbled forward, the world tilting and spinning as his vision went red, then black. His last sight was of a hunched figure, shadowed and monstrous, standing over him with a sledgehammer. The darkness closed in, swallowing him whole as consciousness fled, leaving him alone with the encroaching shadows that had haunted his dreams. Lance awoke with a start, his head throbbing with pain, his vision swimming as he struggled to make sense of his surroundings. The first thing he noticed was the cold, damp earth beneath him, the rough texture of moss and stones pressing into his back. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized he was lying on a raised mound, surrounded by a circle of ancient stones, their surfaces etched with strange, weathered symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow. The trees of the encroaching woods loomed overhead, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky, casting the clearing into a perpetual twilight. Standing at the edge of the circle, silhouetted against the dark woods, was the figure who had struck him unconscious. The man was hunched, his frame gaunt and withered, his clothes hanging off him like rags. In his hands, he held the sledgehammer, its head stained with blood. As Lance watched, the man raised his arms to the sky, his voice echoing through the clearing in a maddened chant. The hunched figure cackled and moaned, the words it spoke dripping with madness. "Lord of the Wood, I call to thee. Come forth and partake of this offering. Take his life, and in turn, give life to the Watcher who is faithful. Give life to me, Orville Hendrickson, who has kept his covenant with you for over 100 years. The name struck Lance like a physical blow. Orville Hendrickson, reported dead nearly 30 years ago, yet here he was, alive and raving, his eyes wide with manic fervor. The ground beneath Lance began to tremble, and a chill spread through the air, a cold that seeped into his bones and sapped his strength. From the shadows at the edge of the clearing, something began to move. It was a mass of crawling darkness, a shape that defied description, a swirling, roiling void that seemed to absorb the light around it. As it crept forward, the grass and plants in its path withered and died, their life force drained by the malevolent presence. The trees closest to the creature began to blacken and rot, their bark peeling away in sickening strips. Lance's heart pounded in his chest as the creature drew nearer, its amorphous tendrils reaching out, almost tasting the air. He struggled to his feet, his head spinning, and instinctively reached for a weapon. Frank's revolver felt heavy in his hand as he raised it at the horror in front of him. He fired 2 rounds into it, followed by 3 more. Each flaring of the pistol's muzzle flash illuminated a different part of the creature, and Lance thought he could make out faces in the undulating black mass, faces of children, men, women, and God help him. He swore he saw Frank's. He aimed and fired a last time just to have the revolver click out of rounds. Desperation gave him strength, and he bolted from the mound, tumbling down its side and landing hard at the base, just feet away from Orville Hendrickson. The old man cackled, his voice a high, keening wail of madness. "What happened to the last owner of the farm?" Lance shouted, his voice raw with fear and anger. "Did you kill him too?" Orville's laughter grew louder, more unhinged. "There never was any other owner, boy. It's always been me, and it always will be. The farm, the land, it's mine by right of the covenant. I own the land, I protect the land, and I feed the land." With a wild gleam in his eye, Orville swung the sledgehammer at Lance, the heavy weapon arcing through the air with deadly intent. Lance barely had time to duck, the hammer whistling past his ear and smashing into the ground with a bone-shattering force. He scrambled back, trying to keep distance between himself and the crazed old man. But Orville was relentless, swinging the hammer again and again, his movements fueled by a twisted combination of fury and ecstasy. Lance's limbs were heavy with fatigue, his vision blurring as he fought to stay alive. The piping sound began to fill the air, a discordant melody with no rhythm, the music of madness itself. The black, shadowy creature was upon the mound now, its tendrils caressing the stones, feeding on the energy of the earth and the ancient symbols carved into the rocks. One of the tendrils searching the ground in front of the creature lashed out and touched Lance's calf. A searing pain shot through his leg, and he felt his life being drained away, his flesh tightening, withering under the creature's touch. His leg twisted in on itself, the pain so intense that it nearly drove him to unconsciousness. But the agony gave him a desperate surge of strength, and he lunged at Orville, pushing him with all his remaining might. Orville's eyes widened in shock as he stumbled backward into the black mass. He screamed in horror as the shadows enveloped him, his voice rising in a shrill, terrified wail. But then, as the darkness began to consume him, his expression changed. A twisted smile spread across his face, his eyes darkening as he whispered, "Yes, yes, I will be with you." Lance watched in horror as Orville's skin began to wrinkle and decay at an accelerated pace, his body rapidly shriveling until it was nothing more than a desiccated husk. The old man's joyous expression remained as he was pulled deeper into the mass, disappearing into the void. Then the creature seemed to twist into a man-like shape, astride 2 legs. It reached up towards the stars, arms formed from tendrils of inky blackness, twisting around each other like snakes, the piping sound growing even louder as it appeared to open an orifice on its head that could be a mouth. It stood close to 15 foot tall, dwarfing the mound it was astride. It seemed to sense Lance and slowly took a step down the slope of the mound towards him. Lance's instinct screamed at him to run, and with a final burst of adrenaline, he turned and fled, his leg throbbing with every step. The piping music grew louder, the notes twisting into his mind, threatening to unravel his sanity. But he forced himself onward, driven by the primal need to survive. Lance stumbled through the underbrush, his breath ragged and labored, the thick air of the forest clinging to his lungs. His heart pounded in his chest, a staccato rhythm that matched the panicked beat of his thoughts. The wound on his calf throbbed with a deep, gnawing pain, the burn spreading like a poisonous web beneath his skin. Each step sent a jolt of agony up his leg, but he could not stop, would not stop. Behind him the shadows moved, a terrible presence bearing down on him. The creature moved like a living nightmare, its form shifting, its dark appendages stretching out from a mass of undulating darkness, one moment, then moving along the ground like some great ape, gaining ground and shortening the distance between itself and Lance. Orville was gone, consumed by that thing, a wretched mass of terror and void. His final moments had been twisted into something grotesque, his form swallowed and absorbed into the greater monstrosity, fueling it, enlarging it. Lance had only caught glimpses of the entity, each sighting more horrific than the last, its towering height blotting out the moonlight, its limbs too many to count, too unnatural to comprehend. And its voice, God, that voice, A chorus of anguished wails, countless tongues screaming in unison, echoing through the woods like the lament of damned souls. The farm came into view, its derelict silhouette barely discernible in the gloom. Lance's eyes locked onto the barn, a sanctuary of sorts. His breath hitched as he hobbled toward the old structure, sweat and fear mixing on his skin. His vision blurred at the edges, whether from pain or terror he couldn't tell. Behind him, the creature's foul presence pressed closer, warping the very air with its approach. He could feel it, like a sickness seeping into his bones. He stumbled to the car, its dark shape a beacon of hope in the swirling madness around him. His hands trembled as he yanked open the door. Frank's lifeless form slumped forward, his eye sockets black and empty, mouth frozen in a grimace of death. There was no time to grieve. With a grunt of effort, Lance pulled Frank's stiff body from the driver's seat, grimacing as he laid his dead friend on the ground. He murmured a quick apology, though his words were drowned out by the rising cacophony behind him, the monstrous sound of wood splintering and the earth groaning beneath the creature's weight. He slid into the driver's seat, his hands shaking as they fumbled with the ignition. The engine coughed, sputtered, and for a brief, horrifying moment, Lance thought it would refuse to start. He cursed under his breath, his body slick with panic. Then, with a roar, the engine came to life, a mechanical growl in defiance of the terror that stalked him. But it was too late. The creature had arrived. Its form loomed over the barn, blotting out the sky, its vast body folding over the structure like a grotesque shroud. Lance could hear the groaning of the rafters, the beams bending and creaking under the unimaginable weight. The walls buckled and the roof began to collapse inward, the monstrous entity suffocating the barn beneath its bulk. Lance had wondered what terrors had Frank faced to make him take his own life. Now he knew those same terrors all too well, and the same dark thoughts of loss and resignation crossed his mind. Ance's mind raced. He could feel the thing reaching for him, the oppressive weight of its presence smothering his thoughts. His body moved on instinct. He kicked open the door, flinging himself out of the car, his leg nearly giving way beneath him as he staggered to the rear of the Ford. His hands scrabbled for the petrol cans stored in the trunk, each one heavier than the last, as panic threatened to overwhelm him. He could hear the beams of the barn snapping like brittle bones behind him, the walls splintering as the creature's mass pressed down, tightening its grip on the fragile structure. With desperate strength, Lance staggered around the barn, upending the cans one by one, dousing the walls, the floor, and even the crumbling rafters with gasoline. The acrid scent filled his nostrils, but it was the only smell that could cut through the stench of rot and decay that clung to everything in this forsaken place. His movements were feverish, hurried. Time was running out. He could feel the creature so close now, the oppressive cold radiating from it, sapping the warmth from the air. His hand fumbled in his coat pocket, searching for the trench lighter. For a brief, maddening moment it seemed lost to him, as if the very fabric of reality was slipping through his fingers. Then, with a flick of the flint, the small flame flared to life, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls of the barn. Without hesitation, he brought the flame to the petrol-soaked wood. The fire caught with a whoosh, bright orange tongues licking up the walls, racing along the fuel like a serpent unleashed. The heat was immediate, overwhelming, and the flames spread with a ferocity that mirrored the terror in Lance's chest. He could feel the growing inferno begin to devour the barn from within, the heat searing his skin as he threw himself back into the driver's seat. The barn was aflame, and the walls were beginning to warp and crack under the onslaught of fire and the crushing weight of the creature. Lance gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled determination, his eyes fixed on the back wall of the barn. The fire roared around him, and for a moment it felt as though the whole world was burning. With a scream of effort, Lance gunned the engine and slammed the car into gear. The Model A lurched forward, careening through the blazing remains of the barn. The rear wheels skidded and slipped on the smouldering ground, but Lance held fast, gripping the wheel as the car tore through the collapsing structure. The impact of wood splintering and metal scraping reverberated through the car as it crashed through the back wall, the flames roaring in its wake. Lance glanced into the rearview mirror as the car sped away. What he saw nearly froze his blood. The creature, now towering above the barn, its body warped and grotesque, a shifting mass of darkness and writhing limbs, was engulfed in flames. The fire clung to it, but instead of consuming the creature, it seemed to cause it unspeakable agony. It writhed, its monstrous form convulsing as it let out a scream, a sound like 1,000 tortured souls crying out in unison. The voices echoed through the night, a wretched cacophony of suffering that would haunt Lance's dreams for the rest of his days. The barn crumbled behind him, the fire licking higher into the night sky. The creature's form began to collapse, folding in on itself as if the fire was devouring it from the inside. Its screams continued, but they were fading now, growing distant as Lance sped down the dirt road, away from the inferno, away from the madness. The orange glow of the fire flickered in the rearview mirror, growing smaller as Lance drove on, the night swallowing him once more. His leg throbbed, his body shook with exhaustion, but he dared not stop. Not yet. The main road was still far ahead, and the horror that clung to his mind refused to release its grip. The world around him seemed darker than before, the stars hidden behind the thick shroud of clouds. But he drove on, his hands tight on the wheel, his heart still racing. He wept, both from the loss of his friend Frank and tears of joy he was still among the living, even though he felt he had left something behind at the accursed farm. The nightmare behind him was over, or so he hoped, but the darkness of the unknown stretched ahead. Continued in the epilogue of The Shadow Farm.